Good day. The last 24 hours have witnessed what has been perhaps, if one believes the reports from Russian military reporters and correspondents and bloggers, the most intense fighting up to now over the course of Ukraine's offensive in the southern regions of Ukraine. Well, of course, it's important to remember that the Russians claim that this area is in fact now part of Russia. And it seems that there's been large numbers of infantry assaults. The Ukrainians have reverted to older tactics. They're no longer trying to overwhelm Russian defenses with armored formations. All the planning and theory about combined arms operations to try to break through defenses, all that seems to have been cast aside. And now we're back to the old practice of sending large numbers of infantry to try to storm positions. And perhaps, if one believes some Russian reports, we've had the closest approximation up to this point to what have been called human wave tactics, though on the part of Ukraine, and I remain skeptical that things are quite this bad. Anyway, the net effect of all of this is that after, more than 24 hours of extremely intense fighting, the Ukrainians appear to have captured a settlement called Pyatikhatki, and that appears to be the sum total of what they've achieved. It seems that Ukrainian losses have been absolutely horrendous, that they have lost large numbers of men, and over the course of the last 24 hours, I've been getting seeing reports flooding in that at Pyatikhatki, this settlement that the Ukrainians did capture, Ukrainian casualties were simply horrendous, with talk that the equivalent of an entire battalion of the Ukrainian army has been destroyed, along with its equipment, and that the settlement itself has been almost completely destroyed as a result of relentless Russian artillery fire and attacks by Russian multiple rocket launch systems of the TOS-1 type, which fire these terrifying thermobaric shells. They're kind of flamethrower machines. And it seems, as I said, that the Ukrainians have suffered huge losses in this area. Indeed, there's even some claims that Russian officers and Russian soldiers have themselves been shocked by the sight of the numbers of dead and wounded soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, littering the battlefields, and that, in fact, it has been all but impossible for the Ukrainians to evacuate their wounded. Now, I want to stress these are all Russian reports. I don't know what the truth is. The Ukrainians have said extremely little about all of this, but it does seem as if Pyatikhatki is the only place that they were able to capture in this attack. And as I said, its value to them is, doubtful. It is still in what was the grey zone up till a few months ago, when the Russians advanced into this area in January and basically prepared their forward positions ahead of their main fortified lines. The main Russian fortified lines continue to be well to the south, and if the Ukrainians are trying to break through to those fortified lines, they are making very slow progress in doing so, and all the reports suggest that they're suffering extremely heavy casualties in their attempts to do so. And it's been increasingly speculated that this is simply not going to be a successful offensive ultimately, that Ukrainian losses for every few meters of territory that they're able to advance through are just too high, and that long before they achieve they reach these fortifications, they will have spent much of their best force, their best military force, and that it really isn't realistic any longer to expect that they can achieve any significant breakthroughs through the heavy Russian fortified lines. And in fact, there's some admission of this even in the British media. Today, yesterday, Colonel Richard Kemp, former British Army officer, person who writes extensively for the Daily Telegraph and who has been incredibly supportive of Ukraine throughout this conflict. Anyway, the Daily Telegraph has an article by him with the words, "Prepare for Ukraine's counter-offensive to falter." And it goes on to say, Ukraine is unlikely to achieve rapid and decisive victories. NATO must guard against France and Germany going wobbly, which seems to be an extraordinary, almost irrelevant issue, given the horror of what is going on the southern battlefields. So anyway, that is where we go. Now, there's been a lot more information. This was not the only place where Ukraine attacked along the southern battlefronts, Piatichatki, but it does seem to be the one place where, as I said, the Ukrainians do seem to have made some advance on the ground. I hesitate to call it progress. A report I've seen suggests that the Russians now have Piatichatki and the Ukrainian troops there in a semicircle, and they're able to shell them, and that there is no cover. Again, this is steppe land to protect Ukrainian troops who try to reinforce positions in this place. And it's also said that the Russian infantry, which played apparently a significant role in causing all these tremendous losses that the Ukrainians suffered, that the Russian infantry always had a plan to retreat from this forward position and to more secure positions in the rear. And this is very much, in fact, appears to be what happened. But again, let me reiterate, these are all Russian reports. I don't have any alternative ones. The Ukrainians are being extremely cagey about what is going on. To reiterate again, despite all the evidence, despite the accumulation of evidence of intense fighting going on along the contact line, Ukraine still has not confirmed that its southern offensive is underway. So that gives us a sense of how bleak things are, perhaps, because I can't help but think that if the offensive was making progress, the Ukrainians would be telling us something about it. And, of course, it's not just in this area, the Zaporozhye, South Donbass area, where Ukraine has been trying to push forward. It's been trying to push forward in other places. There's been, again, suggestions that Ukraine has tried to establish some positions on some of the islands in the Dnieper River. These had to be abandoned when the waters flooded the islands after the Novaya Kakhovka dam collapsed. And there's even been rumors of cross-border raids across the Dnieper, but it doesn't seem as if much of that has really happened. And I understand anyway that the Russians have returned to their original lines in the along the east bank of the Dnieper, and in fact nothing very much seems to be going on there. And there are Ukrainian attacks in other places. There's been more attempts by the Ukrainians to make some advances, apparently in the Avdiivka area. Radovka claims that they did make some advances, but not apparently of any major significance. They've also apparently now been pushed back in the Bakhmut area. The Russians have apparently now launched counterattacks against the Ukrainian troops in the Bakhmut area, and they seem to be pushing the Ukrainians back. And there's reports again from Radovka that the Russians are making attacks now on the village of Orekhovo-Vasilievka, which is again somewhere to the north of, well, the former Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, as it now is. But anyway, that the Russians are actually pushing further in that direction. They never captured this village. I don't think that this was ever planned by the Russians, by the way, to capture Orekhovo-Vasilievka at the time of the fighting in Bakhmut itself, but they are on its outskirts and they've been pushing back in this area. And interestingly, the Institute for the Study of War in Washington has also now acknowledged that the Russians are continuing to make more advances in the Kupiansk area. This is in the north, and of course it could be eventually that the Russians plan to try to recapture Kupiansk, but at the moment there's been there isn't actually very much information coming from there about what's actually going on, and the major focus is on the fighting in the south. And elsewhere, if you're talking about the south, it seems that, again, there were lots of Ukrainian attacks on the Vremevsky ledge, but once again, no real progress by the Ukrainians there. And lastly, I should say, when summarizing what's going on the battlefronts, that there's reports that Zelensky himself is concerned about the way things are going. He's apparently worried that before very long, as the Ukrainian offensive exhausts itself, the situation will return to what the Russians and the Ukrainians refer to as positional fighting. Positional fighting is basically, as far as I can understand, artillery exchanges. And from his point of view, that is the worst possible outcome. It means that at that point, the Russian Colossus has even more time to organize, build up its forces, prepare for the knockout blow it will eventually, doubtless, deal out. But anyway, that's the situation from the battlefronts as far as I can gauge it. As I said, all of the information I've obtained overwhelmingly comes from Russian sources. Ukrainian sources much more quiet, and as we can see, even in Britain, in what is now the third week of this offensive, the British are beginning to become worried that things are not going according to plan. Meanwhile, the Russians also launched another big missile and drone strike across Ukraine over the previous 24 hours. But perhaps more interestingly, they provided us with a little more information about the earlier big missile drone strike that they launched on the previous couple of days, and they clarified the enigma, the mystery about the attack on Kiev. Now, if you recall, a couple of days ago, the Ukrainians were claiming that there'd been a big attack on Kiev, that the Russians had launched 6 Kinzhal missiles, and that the Ukrainians had successfully shot down all of them, and all the missiles that the Russians launched towards Kiev were shot down. And the African delegation, which was presently in Kiev at that time, apparently they heard no explosions. They saw no sign of any activity that was consistent with an air raid. People were moving around in the streets quite freely. There was no sign of great air alarms or anything of that kind. They heard no explosions, and they were skeptical that any kind of actual missile or drone strike on Kiev was taking place. I said that I thought perhaps something had happened, and I speculated that maybe it was another attack on the Giuliani airfield, an attempt to do further damage to Ukraine's air defense systems in and around Kiev, including whatever Patriot missile systems are still based there. Well, the Russians have now explained the mystery. There was a missile strike, and it wasn't apparently focused on the Giuliani base. It was in a particular building located somewhere away from the center of Kiev. The Russians are not telling us what this building was, but they are saying it was a decision-making center. And there's speculation, there's rumor that it was in some way connected to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, that it was a Ukrainian Defense Ministry installation. Anyway, sorry. This building, according to the Russians, was neutralized, whatever that means. I mean, I don't know what it means, but presumably it was hit. There are reports that Ukrainian ambulances and emergency services were rushed to the scene of this building, and there's a huge amount of speculation about what this building was and what it was doing, and who, if anybody, was there. Well, I don't think we have any information that can help us to answer this question. But I will say this, I think that for the Ukrainians, for the Ukrainian government, these attacks on these installations must be a worrying development. They must be concerned that gradually the Russians are going to start closing in, that they're striking at the moment the more peripheral decision-making centres. They've now hit 3, but eventually they might start concentrating them further in the major locations in Kiev. And of course, no doubt, all of these leaders, the Ukrainian leaders who are in Kiev, have access to bunkers and air raid shelters and all of those things. But it does seem as if the Russians also have machines, bombs, rockets, missiles that can penetrate deep through the earth and cause massive damage, even to underground bunkers. And I can remember some months ago seeing General Shoigu, the Russian defense minister. He is actually only a general by, it's only an honorific rank. He's actually a civilian. But I can remember General Shoigu visiting a bomb factory in Russia, aircraft bombs. And one of the bombs that was there in the background, and was clearly recently manufactured, and there seemed to be an assembly line for them, was one of these enormous 9,000 kilo bombs, 9-ton bombs that the Russians have, and which they developed, by the way, shortly after the end of the Second World War, sometime in the early Cold War period, and which are in effect bunker busters. And I wonder whether at some point those bombs are going to be used to strike at these bunkers, and whether showing them in that picture with Shoigu was intended as a warning to the Ukrainians that the Russians do have the capability to strike even deep bunkers. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to guess. But anyway, it is a fact that another decision-making centre has apparently been struck. Now, Stern magazine, the German magazine that published the story that Kyrylo Budanov, is in a coma and is receiving treatment in a hospital in Germany, claims that it has had this confirmed to them by some of the doctors that are treating him. So it could be that this story that Budanov was indeed injured in the attack on one of these decision-making centres the military intelligence building in Kiev. It could be that this is true and that he is indeed in Germany. As I said, it appears to have been partly corroborated by a German media outlet, Stern, and they claim to have spoken to the doctors. And it seems that President Putin, over the course of his discussion with the military correspondents, apparently also said that according to the information the Russians have, General Zaluzhny himself, this commander of the Ukrainian army, the man who has been built up as the military leader of Ukraine, who has been leading the battle, that General Zaluzhny is not actually in Ukraine at all, that he too is in the West, and that he too is receiving some kind of treatment. It could be for shock, it could be for something else. It's all very unconfirmed, but anyway, that is what President Putin said. What I would say is that if all this is true, if Zaluzhny is not actually conducting the operations in southern Ukraine or elsewhere in Ukraine, that does rather beg the question of who is the actual commander now of the Ukrainian forces. And it does also make me wonder whether the decisions are now no longer being made in Kiev about how to conduct operations, whether perhaps they might be being made in Washington or perhaps in Brussels. Who can say? Anyway, turning back to the actual events on the battlefronts, it does seem now as if more Bradley infantry fighting vehicles have been destroyed over the course of the latest fighting. There's some suggestions that a very significant proportion of the total fleet of Bradleys has now been destroyed, that we're looking at between 20 and 40%. I've seen various people making claims about that, and that force is being eroded, even allowing for the replacements which are supposed to be arriving from the United States. What we have not been seeing recently are the Leopard 2s, and I suspect the reason for that is that the Leopard 2 fleet, which was never particularly big, it was around 60 vehicles, has now been very severely depleted, and that perhaps 40% of the Leopard 2s have already been lost, and Ukraine is apparently or supposedly husbanding what is left. This may be the case, or it may not be, but certainly we haven't seen them on the battlefields. And there are other reports circulating that Ukrainian soldiers are now also becoming extremely wary of the Leopard 2s, that they don't consider them to be particularly effective machines, and that there's concerns that they're not actually fit for purpose, that they are indeed inferior to Ukraine's T-64s, T-72s, the kind of Soviet-era tanks that Ukraine used to use. Well, I don't know whether that is true or not. I can't obviously confirm that. But anyway, this is, again, rumours are circulating about this. And, of course, Leopard 2s are not the only tanks that the West has supplied to Ukraine. There's been lots of speculation about what's happened to the Challenger 2s, the British Challenger 2s that the British were supplying to Ukraine. Latest reports suggest that these Challenger 2s are indeed now appearing in the rear, that perhaps the Ukrainians are going to commit them to the fighting before long. There's some speculation about the total number of Challenger 2s that Ukraine has. My information suggests that it's only 14, so this is not a significant number of Challenger 2s. And of course, if these vehicles go the way of the Leopard 2s, if they burn as quickly and as easily as the Leopard 2s do. I think this will start to become a cumulative shock, and it will make the Ukrainians increasingly mistrustful about the equipment that the West is supplying to them. There was, on this topic, a fairly interesting discussion of the state of Ukraine's armoured forces by Simplicius the Thinker on his Substack blog. He suggests that the West is losing its ability to supply Ukraine with large numbers of heavy tanks with 120mm guns, and that it's also basically run through its ability to provide Ukraine with 155mm shells and with guns to fire those shells. Now, some time ago, I said that I thought that the Russians had claimed to have destroyed a larger number of Ukraine's, the M777s that Ukraine had been supplied by the United States than the United States had actually delivered to Ukraine. Somebody contacted me and did the numbers, added up all the numbers, and said that this isn't actually true. But it is now the case that around 80% of these M777s have been destroyed. The numbers of M777s has fallen significantly. And Simplicius the Thinker seems to think the same. And the West has also supplied self-propelled guns and howitzers, 155mm guns and howitzers as well. But it seems that the numbers of these is not great, and again, the Russians have been systematically destroying them, have been knocking them out one by one. And Simplicius the Thinker speculates that at some point over the next few months, what is going to happen is that the West will have to start delivering older tanks to Ukraine. There isn't really much appetite in the United States for supplying M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, and these would be difficult to operate in Ukrainian conditions. Leopard 2s, the West really doesn't have enough Leopard 2s to make up the numbers, and essentially the total number of Leopard 2s that could be supplied has now been supplied. So we're going to see older tanks of previous generation Leopard 1s, of which of course Ukraine is due to receive 100, and there's been suggestions that M60 tanks, the US tanks, the M60 tanks, which were the main US battle tank in the 1960s, late 1960s and 1970s, that they could be supplied to Ukraine in replacement of its losses. And Simplicius the Thinker makes the point that this could also start to extend to artillery, that the artillery that the West will now start to supply to Ukraine will not any longer be 155mm artillery. It will more likely be 105mm artillery, again, consistent with the kind of equipment the West had in the 50s, from the 50s through to the 1970s. And he makes the point that that means that Ukraine will be pitted against Russian tanks equipped with 125mm guns and very powerful armor, and its tanks, its old Western tanks, will not be a match for these Russian tanks. And he also says the same will be the case with artillery, that the Russians will be able to lay down far heavier amounts of artillery, not just because they will have much more artillery than Ukraine, but because the calibers of the shells, the 152 millimeter calibers of the shells launched by the Russian guns will be much heavier. Well, we'll have to see. I mean, this is interesting. It's the sort of thing that I have to say I always find interesting. I should say I've had a very interesting explanation, which from another viewer, another member of the Duran community, explaining a lot about Russian military procurement systems, very much matches things that you will find in Jim Kinnair's books about the Russians emphasizing simplicity and ruggedness and modularity and ease of production, and that this is one reason why the Russians are able to produce machines and vehicles, shells in much greater quantities than the West, whose systems tend by contrast to be over-engineered. Well, I think that is probably true, but as I said, no doubt we'll be getting a lot more information over the course of the few months, and we'll be able to see to what extent these predictions that the Ukrainians will be reduced eventually to lighter, older Western tanks and guns facing off against these increasingly heavy Russian tanks and guns. We will be interested to see to what extent that is true. I would point out that the Russians, it's a fallacy to think that the Russians only produce cheap, simple, rugged equipment. They do that. They do that in enormous volumes, but they do supplement their systems with actually pretty high-tech equipment as well. And there was another interesting report, again uncorroborated, that one of the reasons why Russian kamikaze drones like the Lancet are much more effective than the Western drones, kamikaze drones, that the West has supplied to Ukraine have been, is because the Russian drones have some kind of AI type technology, which means that they are able to hover and detect by themselves Ukrainian machines, tanks, armored vehicles, whatever, and that they themselves automatically then fly down to destroy these Ukrainian machines without any intervention from the controller, which means that there is no capability by Ukraine to jam any signals or to, in fact, take steps that would protect these armored vehicles through jamming signals between the controller and the controller and the drone itself. I'm going to say that I think that may be true, but may be true of some of the new generation of Lancets, which apparently the Kalashnikov Bureau is now busy producing, and which are apparently now entering production. But I'm not convinced that this is true of all Ukrainian, of all of these Russian Lancet drones. I suspect that, at least in some cases, what has simply happened is that the Russian electronic jamming of Ukrainian drones is much more effective than Ukraine's attempts to jam Russian drones. Anyway, this is my own guess. I might be wrong, who's to say? But anyway, we will no doubt find out in due course. Anyway, to return to other things, because of course this is all going on the battlefronts. We see basically stalemate, the Ukrainian offensive failing to make significant progress. We see Russian advances in Kupiansk. We see more Russian missile and airstrikes across Ukraine. We have all of these rumors swirling about Budanov and Zaluzhny. We have all these doubts about the state of Ukraine's future armored forces and artillery forces. But there is also an African delegation now meeting Putin. And I said in my programs yesterday that after meeting Zelensky, the Russians would almost certainly be receiving this delegation from this African delegation. It would probably come to Russia, and that Putin would certainly meet with it, and it has done. Apparently, the meetings between the Africans and Zelensky did not go well. Zelensky again essentially ruled out negotiations. The Africans were extremely unimpressed. They told him that a negotiated solution to the conflict had to come, but apparently Zelensky wasn't listening. He wasn't being accommodating to this. And the African leaders, led by President Cyril Ramaphosa, then went to Poland, took the train back to Poland to fly on to Russia. And of course, things were made even more complicated there because there were some problems at the airports. The Poles created problems for the Africans to fly on to Russia. And there was, again, I'm sure that is going to put the Africans in an even worse mood. But then they did go to Russia and they did meet with Putin. Now, we don't have full information about what was discussed, except that Putin, again, was, as he always is, extremely polite, extremely welcoming, very attentive to what people say. He is careful to listen and have regard to what people say. It'll be a contrast, a change, no doubt, from the difficult meeting with Zelensky. But what we do know is that President Putin provided the African leaders with the draft of the completed agreement that had been agreed between the Russian and Ukrainian negotiators in Istanbul last year on the 29th of March. And he again reiterated what has been the standard Russian position, that the only reason why the Russians decided to withdraw their troops from near Kiev and Chernigov was because they believed that the negotiation was about to produce results and that the war was about to end. Now, I have seen much discussion as to what exactly this draft treaty contained, and I think some people are drawing conclusions or reporting on the contents of this draft treaty based not on its actual text, which I have not seen, but rather on what some Western media outlets say. For example, it's been alleged that the Russians agreed that they would lease Crimea from Ukraine and that they would withdraw back to their 2015, to the pre-February 2022 lines. I've never seen that, and that is not what my understanding was at the time of the negotiations. But it does seem that there was an agreement. My understanding was that the agreement was that Ukraine would agree to remain a neutral country, that it would reduce and regulate the size of its armed forces, that there would be security guarantees provided by various countries, including Russia, that as part of those guarantees, Russia would have a right of veto over the deployment of Western forces, or indeed any forces, in Ukraine, and that those security guarantees would not extend to Crimea and Donbass, in effect acknowledging that they were part of Russian territory. Well, that was my understanding of the agreement based on the reporting that was taking place at the time. Reporting, by the way, drawn overwhelmingly from Ukrainian sources. So it may be that other things were agreed, but I would be a bit careful before rushing to assume that on the basis of some of the claims that I've seen circulating at the moment, which seem to be drawn, as I said, from more recent Western newspaper and other newspaper claims, media claims. But anyway, the key thing to understand is that Putin was able to show the Africans this treaty. He was able to explain to them, look, we were reasonable people, we sat down, we negotiated with Ukraine, we made concessions. This treaty would not have been a fully easy sell in Russia itself. At the time, we made concessions, significant concessions. We pulled our troops back. No one can say that we have not been reasonable in this matter. And I can't help but think that this is going to have a very significant impact, and it could have an effect on the future of whatever negotiations take place from this point on. And certainly, I can't help but think that it will affect the way in which the Africans view this affair after what appears to have been an unsuccessful and, from their point of view, disappointing meeting with Zelensky. They will have had confirmed to them by the Russians the fact that the Russians were willing to compromise, but Ukraine, in the end, backed by the Western powers, was not. Now, the Africans are bound to circulate this to various other countries. China and India, of course, probably already know a lot about the draft treaty. Brazil too. But as I said, this draft treaty is going to circulate over the next few weeks and months, inevitably, amongst the various other member states of the United Nations. And again, I can't help but think that it's going to harden feeling in the global south that the Russians were pushed into this war through Western failure to engage with them on security issues, breaches of promise about eastward expansion of NATO, failure, as Putin again pointed out and has pointed out many times, failure to implement the Minsk agreement, indeed pulling the wool over the Russians' eyes over the Minsk agreement. And the long and the short of it is that I think the Russians probably feel that, from their point of view, even if the African delegates will leave Russia without having a definite peace proposal on the table that they can work with, the Russians will no doubt feel that they have made their key point, that in effect, and despite all Western rhetoric, it is they who have been reasonable throughout in this matter, and that when they say that the reason this conflict is going on is because the West simply will not address their concerns, that they are right. Anyway, I've had to shorten my video today, which I suspect some people will be relieved to hear, because I'm under very considerable time pressure, and this is where I'm going to stop. Let me repeat again, you can find all our programs on our various channels, on locals, first of all, platforms, locals, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can go to our shop and support our work. There you can buy yourself all our amazing things, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all of those great things. And of course, you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribe Star. links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this somewhat rushed video, then please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. I presume over the next few days we'll be getting a better sense of what really has happened over the last 24 hours in these battles. If the reports that I am seeing trickle in are true, then it seems as if Ukrainian losses have been horrendous and something in some ways very terrible has happened. But at the moment, as of the making of this video, I can't be sure, and besides, the battle is still underway. The Ukrainians continue to try to push forward, and we'll have to wait and see what, if anything, that they achieve. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.